We've already covered exposure latitude and dynamic range, but I know that some people find this subject very difficult to grasp, so I'll try a different way of putting the idea across. Okay, so a pixel can only respond to a certain brightness range. If it's too little light, then the sensor just records the thing as black. Okay, so everything darker than this area here, all the way back, would register as black. And anything brighter than this part here would register as white. So we only have a limited brightness range that we can get tones to be in. So in order to understand how a pixel responds to light, I'll use water as an intuitive substitute. So just imagine a water pump as our source of light particles, and those are called photons. These are represented by water droplets. Now the water tank represents our pixel, and when it's empty at the bottom it registers as black, and when it's full we register it as white, just as if it was a pixel, so going from black through the greys into white, or if it was a colour, red, mid-red, and no red, or no red, mid-red and pure red. So the light source, is connected to the tank by a hose. So the tank, our pixel, connected by a hose, and these are the photons of light, the lens. So the brightness of the scene can be represented by if we pump harder, that would represent an increase of light intensity. Okay, more light going through. Aperture. If the pipe and entrance hole to the tank were wider, this would represent a widening of the lens aperture. More water or light could pass at a given time. And shutter speed can be represented by the duration of pumping. So the longer we pump, the longer the shutter speed. The shorter we pump, the shorter the shutter speed. And ISO, the diameter of the tank, could represent the ISO speed. So a smaller diameter would fill up quicker. So if you have a little small tank here, any amount of light coming in here or water would fill up a lot quicker than a large diameter tank. So with no pumping, no water representing our light can enter the tank. Okay, so with no water, nothing gets into the tank. So the sensor records everything as black. Nothing's got into the sensor or the tank. As we start pumping, it takes a certain amount of pressure. We need a certain amount of water or light before anything even starts to happen in our sensor. So it's at this point that this amount of brightness that the sensor can start to perceive a tone other than black. Okay, so we need a certain amount of pressure of water before it even starts to register anything other than black. So as more water droplets, our photons, enter the tank, it starts to fill up. There we go. So in our analogy, our pixel will now be recording a brighter light source, a light grey. So we've gone from black to white, but this would be a kind of light grey. Now there comes a time when the tank, our sensor, cannot hold any more water or light particles, photons, and the pixel registers this as white. It just can't hold any further light. So we now say that the sensor is saturated. Any further brightness, pumping of our pump, it just goes straight out and it just registers everything as pure white. So anything brighter is just a pure white. So any further brightness increase will be just registered as white. So the difference between the light levels where the sensor just starts to respond to an amount of light at the bottom here, and when it cannot discern any further brightness increase, so between here and here, that's termed the dynamic range. Okay, and we define this in stops. We say it's got a dynamic range of 10 stops or something like that. As a general principle, the greater the dynamic range, the better the tonal quality, because you get a lot more tonal gradation in your images. Principles that can increase the dynamic range. And of course, as new cameras have come on the market, this is one of the areas, as well as number of pixels, this is one of the areas where they've really brought on significant benefits, the dynamic range. Larger sensors, because larger sensors aren't so inherently noisy, they can receive more light per sensor, then larger sensors tend to have a larger dynamic range than smaller sensor sizes. And of course, the use of RAW files. RAW files allow you to use the entire dynamic range captured by the sensor, whereas a JPEG will artificially clip the dark areas and the light areas in order to compress the images into a smaller file size, an 8-bit file size at that. So you need to use RAW files to get the benefit of your full dynamic range of the camera. So two of the latest cameras, they've done tests on them to see what the dynamic ranges are, and we'll have a look at those. But just a quick look at the color slide. When we used to use transparency film, it had a dynamic range of maybe up to about 6.5 stops. Not very great at all. Color negative film went up to about 10 stops of dynamic range. Black and white negative, some of it went up to like 14 stops. So we had a limited amount, certainly with the color slides. But now, with the very modern, most fairly latest cameras, Nikon claim that at an ISO of 100, it has a dynamic range of 14 stops. The Canon 5D Mark III, that's got a more limited dynamic range. At 100 ISO, about 11.5 stops. And my tests showed it's a similar sort of value. Mine came out around about 12 stops. But one of the things you need to be aware of is as you increase the ISO rating on your camera, so the dynamic range drops proportionally. Okay, until when you get up into the very high ISO speeds, you're getting dynamic range of not very much at all. Okay, so this is one of the reasons why you need to be trying to make sure that you're using a slower ISO speed as you can to get, depending on the subject, material subject, because as you increase the ISO setting, so your dynamic range, the tonal range within your images, also must drop as well. So hopefully that's given you a bit more of an insight as to what dynamic range means in your camera.